In this segment, we're going to discuss changes over time as they relate to the labor supply. So let's think about some different types of changes that we're going to see in the slope of the indifference curve and what that might mean as we have changes over time in our working lives. We'll look at the changes as a result of multiple income households. We'll look at changes as a result of introducing dependents within our household, perhaps children or others. And then we'll take a look at some of the effects of retirement in terms of this labor-supply relationship as we've developed this model of budget and utility. First, let's think about what it means when we have a flat or a relatively shallow indifference curve versus a relatively steep indifference curve. So let's begin with our initial construction here. And just think about this at 8 and 8 hours of labor and leisure and $160 of wage income. So what would a flat indifference curve look like? Well, it's going to be very shallow. Might come along like this, which simply means that this individual, once they have achieved their income level, a necessary income level, then they have a fairly shallow or fairly low trade-off between leisure and labor. It's a trade-off that's at a different level than the budget curve, of course. It's more steeply sloped than the budget curve itself, but it's not a very steep slope, which means that after they have received this, say $160 a day and 8 hours of leisure, which they've gotten by having 8 hours of labor, of course, then they're continuing to perhaps be willing to trade labor for leisure, but they would require a slight increase in their wage to do so. So they would see a higher dollar amount than they might be able to see on this budget curve, which is why we become tangent at this point. Let's contrast that with a steep curve then. A steep curve is going to be very different. A steep curve might come in more like this, such that once the $160 or the budget need has been met, then in order to get this individual to give up more leisure time, we require a pretty steep increase in income, which means that the wage rate must have to go up rather a lot to accomplish this. So flat indifference curves, steep indifference curves really are just giving us an idea of what kind of trade-off between labor and leisure must be required, what kind of change in wage must be required in order to get them to make that trade-off. And of course, when it's a steep indifference curve, then what we've really seen is that a significant wage increase must take place or a significant trade-off relationship exists. When it's a flat indifference curve, then we see that the requirement is not nearly as robust, as steep, so that the individual with a flat indifference curve is going to be willing to trade leisure or labor for leisure at a relatively nominal increase in wage. Let's think about the presence of multiple income households and the change that might bring about for our indifference curve. Coming back to our 160 and 8 and 8. And let's assume we have some initial condition of an indifference curve here. Well, that's not very good. I wanted that to become tangent to the budget line. See if I can do that again. That's a little bit better. At U1. And this is where there is a single income in an existing household. And so as we're thinking about this, we're having to suppose that the household's requirements and structure for income needs remain constant. And so now if we see a second income enter the household, what are we likely to see in terms of a change in this indifference curve? Well, it's not an issue of it becoming steeper or flatter. It's an issue of it shifting its position on the budget. So if this household had a budget need of 160 and with one income, then we might be able to suppose that the household has perhaps a budget need of maybe 200 with two incomes, but that's 100 per worker in which case we have to find $100 here. And we see that we then have a different level, a different U1. Or actually, we're going to call this now U2, excuse me. So we haven't changed necessarily the happiness level on this, unless we find that we've chosen to have more than the income we were looking for before. And the reason I went from 160 to 200 is supposing that the second income also brought some expenses, transportation expense, etc., along with it. Maybe some child care expense, maybe some house cleaning expense, etc. So when we think about moving from a single income to two incomes in a household, we're thinking about the household structure remaining constant otherwise, in which case we see that the indifference curve is likely to move out and to the right, not necessarily a greater level of happiness, but having received the same level of happiness by some structural change in the household. What if this household with two incomes wanted a greater level of happiness? Well, that would then be evident by each of the workers having each their own labor-leisure trade-off model, each of them being at U1, in which case they both have happiness level U1. We've combined that, and maybe it's a greater aggregation of overall utility or happiness in this household. Well, what might this look like as we go from households without dependents to households with dependents? And so as we make that one particular change, going from household without a dependent to household with a dependent, what we're really talking about is everything else staying constant in the household. Remember that as economists, we try to look at our marketplace as clinically as we can. We look at our models as clinically as we can, which simply means that we introduce as few changes at any point in time as possible. So the only change we're going to see here is a change of dependence in the household. Nothing else has changed. And so assume that we have an initial condition with our utility here, and that we see an increase in dependence in the household. Well, if we have an increase in dependence in the household, I think we must see an increase in the required budget, because, as I recall, dependents bring with them some additional expense. I have dependents in my household. I remember this. In which case, we're going to see a shift in our indifference curve upwards from U1 to just some different U1, same level of happiness, but now it's based upon a increase in dependence in the household that brought about an increase in expense in the household. Now, you might argue that if a household was interested in bringing dependents into it, let's say those dependents are children, that maybe the bringing the children in is actually giving them enough additional happiness or utility that this U1 would actually be more happiness or more utility than the initial U1 or the red U1. And that might be a reasonable argument to make. But what we're looking at is the labor-supply relationship, and as these decisions affect our utility and our decision as to how many hours of labor or leisure to supply. So in this case, we have 10 and 6. So as we saw the indifference curve move because of a shift in 1 to 2 incomes, we saw that we had more leisure and less labor per worker. As we see the indifference curve shift as we increase dependence, we see that we have less leisure, more labor. So that's really what we're wanting to think about, because this has everything to do with labor supply. So now let's think about the effects of retirement. We're going to look at the placement of the indifference curve, maybe just as one is preparing to retire, then in retirement without any wage income, maybe just endowment income, investment income, Social Security income, etc. And then we'll take a look at retirement with labor participation. So first, pre-retirement. Let's think about our initial condition again at $160 a day and 8 hours. And my guess is that when somebody is nearing retirement, they're becoming a little bit more flexible. Maybe they can, on any given day, maybe they're motivated to receive that 160 at 8 hours, or maybe they don't need it as much because the house is paid for, the kids are grown, and travel, which might be where they get some of their happiness, or golf, or hobbies, or what have you, or going to visit the grandchildren, that's somewhat discretionary. Whereas making the house payment, making the car payment is not as discretionary. So if we are thinking about the pre-retirement individual, remembering that we started with a kind of a mid-career U1, then the pre-retirement individual probably has an indifference curve that's going to look a little bit more like U2, where they're on any given day, or maybe on all days, they're willing to take less income so they can receive more leisure, which means they had less labor. Well, that makes sense to us. That flexibility is something that we can think about. What about the individual that now is squarely retired? They've completely retired, and they are receiving all of their income from other non-labor sources. Well, where's their indifference curve? That indifference curve is going to be what we refer to as a corner solution. And so they're going to have their full level of happiness and satisfaction here on this indifference curve. We'll call it U3 in this case. U1, U2, U3 is not intended in this case to suggest that they're higher levels of utility or happiness. They're just knowing that they're different curves. But it's got a corner solution such that we're here at 0 hours of labor and 16 hours of leisure. Let me redraw this because I see that I've actually let this go below the zero earnings line, so wages line. It's actually going to asymptote right along that line because we have zero wage income. I don't want to suggest that it becomes negative wage incomes from, or negative income from earnings or from working. So it's going to become a corner solution. It'll be right on this line. Well, how might that differ, once again, from pre-retirement and mid-stage careers? Well, we can see that because of the placement of the curves. But now, how might it differ from someone that's retired but has chosen to actually maintain some participation in the labor market? Maybe I retired, I decided after a couple of years, the golfing, woodworking, gardening, traveling, etc., they gave me some utility, but I really liked being in the labor market. Or maybe I found that I needed to be in the labor market. I just needed a little bit more income, maybe not a full-time income. Well, that's going to then return me perhaps to U2. It's going to return me to a place where I've brought my indifference curve upwards on this line, on my budget line, so that I have some income. I still have some increase in leisure over maybe my initial condition, but I don't have as much increase in leisure as I would have had I gone all the way to the corner solution of 0 hours of labor and 16 hours of leisure. But if I have a financial need, or if I have just a desire to be actively engaged, then my indifference curve will shift, and it may not be a greater level of happiness. In fact, more often than not, it's going to be the exact same level of happiness, but just at a different position. And we know it's going to be the exact same level of happiness because we've chosen it rather than the original condition, but we've stayed on our budget curve.